Picture a factory floor in Orange, New Jersey. The year is 1917. Long tables stretch across the room, and at them sit rows of young women, shoulders bent slightly forward, faces close to their work. The light is good. Management makes sure of that, because the work requires precision. Each woman holds a small paintbrush. Each brush dips into a small pot of paint. And each brush tip, shaped carefully to a fine point, moves with practice speed across the surface of a tiny watch dial, tracing the numbers, filling in the markers, one after another after another. Here is the thing that should stop you. At the end of a shift, as these women gather their coats and file out through the factory doors and into the evening streets of New Jersey, something strange happens. Something that, in another story, in a fairy tale or a dream, you might find beautiful. They glow. Not the building. Not the street. Asterisk them. Asterisk their skin. Their hair. Their dresses. The paint that has settled, over hours of work, into the fine creases of their hands and the curves of their collarbones and the loose strands of their hair, it glows. A soft, greenish-white light. Like Foxfire. Like bioluminescence. Like something living. And the women? They think it is wonderful. They go to dances still glowing. They paint their nails at home. Their teeth, some of them joke, flash green in the dark. They are proud. They don't know yet what the glow means. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story you come here for, please do hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who might never have heard these names, and these women deserve to be heard. If you found the still hour because someone suggested a topic in the comments, thank you, truly. This channel lives and breathes on those suggestions. And speaking of where you are, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it? There is something I love about imagining this community spread across time zones, all of us lying in the dark at different hours, listening to the same stories together. Now, lights off. Let's go. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And spare a thought tonight for the women who used to glow in the dark, who were told the glow was harmless, who believed it because why wouldn't you? Because they were young and the work was good and the people in authority said so, and who paid a price that nobody should ever have to pay. This is their story. It is not easy, but it is important. And they deserve someone to tell it slowly and carefully, and with the weight it has always been owed. So let me ask you something. Or several somethings. The kind of questions that tend to follow you into sleep. What would you do if the company you worked for, the company signing your paycheck, the company whose managers greeted you each morning, the company whose work you were genuinely good at, told you that something was safe? Would you question it? Maybe. But probably not. Because why would you? They know more than you do. They have chemists and executives and lawyers. They have the resources to actually find out whether something is dangerous, and if it were, surely they would tell you. Surely. Did these women have any real choice? That's not a rhetorical flourish, I want you to actually sit with that. They were working-class women in 1917. Their families needed the income. The factory pay was better than almost anything else available to them. The alternatives were harder work for less money. What does choice mean in that context? What does it mean to say someone chose to take a risk they didn't know existed? How many people knew? That is a question I want you to hold on to, because when we get to the part of this story where the records start to surface, the answer is going to sit in your chest like a stone. Why did it take so long for anyone to listen? The women got sick. The women went to doctors. The doctors, some of them, reported their findings. Scientists raised concerns. And still, the company operated. Still the women painted. Why is that? What does it take for an alarm to become loud enough that the people with power to act on it actually do? And perhaps most pointedly, what does it take for the truth to finally matter when the people telling it are young women? Young women without money, without lawyers of their own, without political connections, without any of the levers that, in the early 20th century, determined whether a person's suffering was worth taking seriously? These are old questions. You probably already know, somewhere in the quiet part of your mind, that they are not entirely historical. Orange, New Jersey. 1917. America has just entered the First World War, and the country is adjusting to what that means. Men leaving for Europe, factories retooling, money and resources and urgency flowing through the industrial Northeast like a current. The United States Radium Corporation is booming. And it needs workers. The work they are offering is intricate, delicate. It requires a steady hand, good eyesight, and the patience to sit at a table for hours, guiding a fine brush across the face of a watch dial no bigger than a coin. The company will train you. The pay is good, unusually good for factory work, especially work available to women. Some of the dial painters are earning more than their fathers. So they come. Teenagers, some of them. Young women in their late teens and early 20s. Sisters, sometimes. Neighbors. Friends who heard about it from friends. They take their places at the long tables under the good lights, and they learn the technique, and they get fast, and they talk while they work, and they laugh, and they paint. And when the shift ends and they walk home through the autumn dark, you can see them coming from a block away. To understand what happened in that factory in Orange, New Jersey, you first have to understand the world that made it possible. And that world was a world utterly, deliriously, almost comically enchanted with radium. It begins, as so many things begin, with a woman working in difficult conditions with insufficient resources and extraordinary persistence. Marie Curie, born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw in 1867, at a time when Poland was under Russian occupation and women were not permitted to attend university, eventually made her way to Paris, enrolled at the Sorbonne, and began doing the kind of science that rearranges what humanity thinks it knows about the universe. In 1898, working alongside her husband Pierre in a converted shed that they used as a laboratory, she isolated two new elements. The first she named polonium, after her occupied homeland. The second, the one that glows, the one that changes everything, she named radium. Radium is remarkable. Even now, even knowing what we know, it is hard not to find it remarkable. It glows continuously with no external power source. It emits energy from its own atomic structure, from the decay of its nucleus, which means it is warm to the touch. Spontaneously warm. Permanently warm. In an era before the structure of the atom was well understood, before the word radioactivity had even been coined, Marie Curie coined it, the discovery of an element that simply glowed and gave off heat for no apparent reason must have felt genuinely miraculous. And the world responded accordingly. By the early 1900s, radium had become something close to a cultural obsession. Newspapers covered it breathlessly. Scientists celebrated it. And entrepreneurs, who have never in the history of human commerce required much encouragement to sell people things they don't need, set about putting radium in everything they possibly could. Radium was in toothpaste. This is true. A product called Doramad radioactive toothpaste promised that radioactivity would strengthen your teeth and kill bacteria. There was radium in face cream. In soap. In suppositories. I will leave that one with you. There was a chocolate company in Germany selling radium-infused chocolate. There were radium-infused water crocks, ceramic containers with small amounts of radium in the base, designed to charge drinking water with radioactivity the way a filter might purify it, marketed as health products and sold to wealthy households who left them on their kitchen counters and drank from them daily. A product called Raditha, essentially radium dissolved in water, was sold as a tonic and energy supplement. Eben Bias, a wealthy American socialite and amateur golf champion, became famous for consuming it daily in quantities his doctor advised against. He consumed so much of it that his skull literally began to dissolve. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline about his eventual death in 1932, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." Which is one of those headlines that manages to be simultaneously darkly funny and absolutely horrifying. Radium spas opened across Europe and America. You could bathe in radium water. You could sleep on radium-infused mattress pads. There were radium lace stockings, though that particular claim was more marketing than chemistry. Children's toys were briefly sold with radium components. It was everywhere. Now, here is the important thing to understand about all of this, the thing that separates it from simple greed or simple stupidity, though it was certainly also both of those things. The science of radioactivity was genuinely new. The understanding that radioactive decay involved the emission of particles that could damage biological tissue, that was not yet established. Marie Curie herself didn't fully understand the danger of prolonged radiation exposure. She handled radium with her bare hands. She kept samples in her desk drawer. Her notebooks, her actual laboratory notebooks from the 1890s, are still radioactive today. They are kept in a lead-lined box at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and researchers who want to study them are required to sign a waiver acknowledging the risk. Marie Curie developed aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by decades of radiation exposure. She died of it in 1934. She did not know she was poisoning herself. Nobody did. Not yet. So the world in which the United States Radium Corporation set up its factory in Orange, New Jersey was a world in which radium was something between a wonder and a luxury good, in which the glow was aspirational, the radioactivity was sold as health-giving, and the dangers were theoretical at best and unimaginable at worst. Into that world came a product called Undark. A product that required workers. Workers who would sit at long tables, hour after hour, and bring their paintbrushes to their lips. And the United States Radium Corporation hired them, and trained them, and told them the paint was safe. Which brings us to the women themselves. The paint had a name, and the name deserves a moment of attention. *Undark. Someone in a marketing department somewhere in the history of the United States Radium Corporation came up with that name, and I want to give them grudging credit because it is a genuinely effective piece of branding. It sounds scientific. It sounds modern. It sounds like the future, specifically, like the kind of future that turns darkness into something conquerable, something the ingenuity of industry has simply solved. *Undark. As if darkness were a problem and this were the answer. Undark was a mixture of radium and zinc sulfide, a compound that, when excited by the energy released by radium's radioactive decay, emits light. The glow, in other words, is not the radium itself. The radium is the power source. The zinc sulfide is the bulb. The radium bombards the zinc sulfide with alpha particles. The zinc sulfide absorbs that energy and re-emits it as visible light, and the result is a paint that glows in the dark continuously, without any external power, for years. In practical terms, this was extraordinarily useful. Think about the moment in history. 1917. The United States has just entered the First World War. In the trenches of Europe, soldiers need to be able to read their watches in the dark, need to know when to move, when to wait, when the barrage ends and the advance begins. Pilots navigating in darkness need readable instruments. Naval officers need workable compasses. The military demand for luminous dials was enormous, and the United States Radium Corporation was one of a small number of companies that could supply it. The profits were real and they were large. Military contracts in wartime are not small things. The factory in Orange was running at full production, and the demand, if anything, was increasing. The women at the long tables were not peripheral to the company's success, they were the reason for it. Their hands were the hands that made the product. Their eyes were the eyes that guided the brush. Their patience, their skill, their willingness to lip point hundreds of dials per shift, that was the mechanism by which the company made money. And what they were working with, what they were ingesting, in the small amounts that nonetheless accumulated over months and years of daily exposure, was genuinely extraordinary material. Radium-226, the isotope primarily used in Undak, has a half-life of 1,600 years. Which means that the radium these women were painting onto watch dials in 1917 is still radioactive today. The watches are still radioactive. The buildings where they worked are, in some cases, still contaminated. The cemeteries where some of the women are buried, I want to be careful here and come back to this, have been found to contain radioactive contamination in the soil. Radium, when it decays, produces radon gas. Radon decays into other radioactive isotopes. The chain of decay is long and the products are varied, and several of them are particularly damaging to biological tissue. When radium is ingested, when the body absorbs it through the lips and the mouth and the digestive system, it is taken up by the bones. The bones become, in effect, a source of continuous internal radiation. Alpha particles released by radioactive decay are particularly damaging to soft tissue at close range. They can't penetrate skin from outside, but from inside, embedded in bone, they irradiate the surrounding marrow and tissue continuously, without pause, for as long as the radium remains. And radium in bone has a half-life of decades in biological terms. None of this was told to the women at the long tables. What they were told was that the paint was safe, that radium was healthy, that there was nothing to worry about. Lip, dip, paint. This is the chapter 1 warned you about. This is the one that sits in your chest. The United States Radium Corporation knew that radium was dangerous to handle. They knew this not because they were particularly advanced in their understanding of radiation biology, they weren't, but because the people in the industry who worked closely with radium had already noticed that precautions seemed wise. The chemists and executives and researchers who handled radium in the company's laboratories did not do so with bare hands. They used lead screens. They used tongs. Some wore protective aprons. They did not put brushes to their lips. They treated the material with the kind of careful distance that acknowledges, even without a fully formed scientific theory of why, that something is not to be trifled with. The women painting the dials were not given lead screens. They were not given tongs. They were not told to avoid putting brushes to their lips. They were told to lip point. Let me be precise about this, because precision matters here. The people running the United States Radium Corporation were not ignorant of radiation risk in the abstract. They were specifically and deliberately taking precautions for themselves that they were not extending to their workers. This is not a case of a company that didn't know better. This is a case of a company that knew better and chose, for the sake of production efficiency and profit, not to act on what they knew. By the early 1920s, concerns about the health of radium workers were beginning to surface in scientific literature. Frederick Flynn, a physiologist, and William Bailey, the same William Bailey who would later be revealed as the man behind Raditha, the radium-infused tonic that dissolved Eben Bias's skull, conducted early studies on radium workers that the company was aware of. But the company was not interested in research that complicated its position. The company's medical consultant at various points was a physician named Frederick Flynn. Flynn had no particular expertise in occupational medicine or radiation health. What he had was a relationship with the company and a willingness to produce findings that suited their interests. When Flynn examined dial painters who were becoming ill, he consistently concluded that radium was not the cause of their symptoms. He published findings suggesting the women were in good health at a time when the evidence of their declining health was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His research, presented as independent medical opinion, was used by the company to defend itself against any suggestion of liability. There is a name for this. We call it corporate-sponsored science, And while the techniques have become more sophisticated in the century since, the basic structure has not changed. You find a credentialed person willing to produce findings consistent with your preferred outcome. You present those findings as objective evidence. You use those findings to delay, complicate, and ultimately suppress the research and testimony that contradicts you. And in the meantime, production continues. Arthur Roeder was the president of the United States Radium Corporation during much of the relevant period. The historical record on exactly what Roeder knew and when is complicated. He would later claim ignorance of his workers' conditions, but the evidence that has emerged over decades of research suggests that the corporate decision-making at the company during this period consistently prioritized production and profit over worker safety, and that this was not accidental. When outside researchers attempted to study the dial painters, they found their access restricted. When workers began to raise concerns, those concerns were managed, minimized, and in some cases met with suggestions that the women's health problems had other causes. One of the particularly vicious elements of the company's strategy was the effort to reframe the women's illnesses as personal failings. Company-associated physicians would later suggest, and in some cases directly claim, that the jaw deterioration and bone disease being experienced by dial painters was consistent with syphilis. This was not a diagnosis made in good faith. It was a diagnosis calculated to stigmatize. Syphilis in the early 1920s carried enormous social shame. To diagnose a young woman with syphilis was to raise questions about her character and her conduct, questions that would complicate her credibility, isolate her from community support, and make the prospect of pursuing any kind of legal remedy enormously more difficult. It was, in short, a way of using social stigma as a legal shield. I want you to sit with the deliberateness of that for a moment. The company did not simply fail to protect its workers. It actively, consciously, specifically worked to undermine the credibility of those workers when they began to get sick. It hired doctors to produce favorable reports. It restricted access to independent researchers. It used the diagnosis of a sexually transmitted disease to shame women whose bodies were being destroyed by radioactive decay. And the women kept getting sick. It did not happen all at once. The body is patient. The body compensates, and adapts, and keeps working long past the point where it should reasonably be expected to, and so the illness crept in slowly and presented itself in ways that were easy, at first, to misread. It started, for many of the women, in the mouth. Teeth that ached. This was not unusual. Dental pain was common in the early 20th century, when dentistry was less advanced and oral health was, for working-class people especially, often not a priority. So when Grace Fryer's teeth began to ache, she did what you did. She went to a dentist. The dentist examined her and, finding a tooth that seemed troubled, extracted it. This was also common. Extraction was the go-to solution. But where there should have been healing, where the socket should have closed and the gum should have recovered, there was instead continued pain. And then another tooth. And then the discovery, when the dentist looked more closely, that the bone of the jaw was not behaving the way bone should. It was soft. It was porous. It was not holding itself together the way living bone is supposed to do. For some of the women, the jaw deterioration became severe with a speed that was alarming. Molly Maggia, Amelia Maggia, the young woman I asked you to remember, was one of the first of the dial painters to become seriously ill. She had worked at the factory and then left, as many workers did, to take other employment. But the radium she had ingested during her time painting dials had already settled into her bones, and by 1921, her health was declining in ways that baffled and distressed her family and the doctors they brought her to. Molly's jaw pain intensified. She went to a dentist. The dentist extracted a tooth. The socket did not heal. Another dentist was called. Another tooth came out. The bone around the extraction sites began to behave in a way that the dentists had no framework for, It was not infected in the conventional sense, it was not responding to the treatments that should have addressed an infection, and it was spreading. The tissue of her jaw was, very simply, dying. What happened next is one of the most harrowing passages in this entire story, and I'm going to tell it carefully. A physician named Joseph Neff, who was treating Molly, eventually removed what remained of her lower jaw in an attempt to halt the spread of the necrosis. He removed her entire lower jaw. And still the decay continued. It spread to other bones. Her skull was affected. Her ear canals were affected. By the time Molly Maggia died in September of 1922, at the age of 24, she had been through a level of physical suffering that the medical professionals attending her described with barely concealed horror. The doctor who eventually performed a post-mortem examination and tested her remains found that her bones were radioactive. He found it by accident. When he put her jawbone in a darkroom, it glowed. She had been carrying the light inside her all along. The same light that had seemed magical on the walk home from the factory. The same light the women wore to dances. Grace Fryer's experience was different in its specifics but alike in its essential horror. Her spine began to deteriorate. The bones that were supposed to hold her upright, the vertebrae that give a person the architecture of their own posture, were weakening, collapsing, becoming unreliable. She began to need external support. She was fitted with a brace, first one brace, then a more extensive one, and the braces became a kind of marker of her decline, of the slow narrowing of what her body would allow her to do. And she went to doctors, as the women all went to doctors, and the doctors were confused. The presentation of what was happening to these women had no clear precedent. Bone disease of this kind, progressing at this rate, appearing in young women with no obvious explanation, it was outside the existing medical vocabulary. Some physicians were genuinely doing their best in conditions of real diagnostic uncertainty. Others were working with the influence of company-connected medical opinion, which consistently and deliberately pointed away from radium as a cause. And others, particularly in the early years, reached for the diagnosis that the company's interests were served by syphilis. To be told, when you are already frightened and in pain, that the cause of your suffering is a disease that implies sexual impropriety, to have that diagnosis enter your community, your family, your neighborhood, is a cruelty layered on top of a cruelty. Some of the women's families faced social consequences from the false diagnoses. The women themselves had to carry the weight of a stigma they had done nothing to earn, on top of the weight of an illness that was taking from them, piece by piece, the physical life they had expected to have. Catherine Schaub, who had been a teenager when she began working at the factory, found herself in her early 20s in a body that had become unreliable and painful and bewildering. The future she had been in the process of imagining, the way all young people are always in the process of imagining their futures, had been rewritten by something she had been told was safe. She had done the job. She had done it well. She had done it the way she was taught. And this is what it had returned to her. The company's position, during these years, was that the women's illnesses were not the company's concern. Their own doctors said radium hadn't done it. There was nothing to see here. There was certainly no liability. The women who were suffering from things unrelated to their employment, and if they wanted to make claims to the contrary, well, the company had lawyers. And here is the thing, here is the moment I told you we were building toward, the moment that changes this story from a tragedy into something else entirely, something that required from these women a kind of courage that had no roadmap and no guarantee of reward. The women began to understand. It was not a single moment. It was gradual. It was the slow accumulation of what couldn't be explained away anymore. It was looking at your colleague, your friend, your sister, and seeing the same symptoms in her face that were in yours, and understanding, in the way that the body understands things before the mind has words for them, that this was not coincidence. It was Grace Fryer, in a brace, reading a newspaper article about radium workers. It was Catherine Schaub making connections. It was women who had been told their suffering was their own mysterious misfortune beginning to understand that their suffering was, in fact, specific and caused and, most importantly, known star. Known to the people who had employed them. Known to the people who had trained them to put the brushes to their lips. Known to the people who had protected themselves with LED screens while sending young women to work without protection. The anger of that understanding, the specific, clarifying, almost physical anger of realizing you have been lied to about something that has cost you your health, your future, possibly your life, that anger is a particular kind of energy. It can devastate a person. It can also move them. For Grace Fryer and Catherine Schaub and Edna Husman and the others, sick, frightened, in pain, running out of time in ways they were only beginning to fully understand, it moved them. They decided to fight. Asterisk, that is where we leave part 1 of the story of the Radium Girls. Asterisk, in part 2, we will follow Grace Fryer and her colleagues into the legal battle, one of the most significant occupational health lawsuits in American history, and we will meet the people who helped them and the people who tried to stop them, and we will sit with the particular anguish of fighting for justice against a clock that is ticking in your own bones. Asterisk, for now, though, let the room be quiet. Let the blanket be warm. Asterisk, spare a thought for Molly Maggia, who glowed in the dark and was 24 years old when she died. Asterisk, spare a thought for Grace Fryer, who put on a back brace and decided anyway. Asterisk, and sleep well. You're safe. You're here. Asterisk, this is the still hour. I'll see you in part 2. The Radium Girls, part 2. And that is where the story turns. Because these women, sick, frightened, dismissed by doctors and courts and their own employer, did something that nobody expected. They decided to fight back. Not in the way that people fight back in the movies, with sudden fire and a rallying speech. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more extraordinary. They were women who had been told, repeatedly and by people with authority and credentials and suits, that they were wrong. That their bodies were wrong. That their suffering was wrong. That the company was not responsible and the paint was not dangerous and their teeth and their jaws and their crumbling bones were the result of something else, something internal, something that had nothing to do with the luminous paint they had swirled on their tongues for years under the supervision of people who knew exactly what it was doing to them. And they decided not to believe that anymore. That decision, made quietly, made by women who were in pain, who were frightened, who were in some cases months from dying, that decision is one of the most quietly heroic things I have ever come across in any story I have told on this channel. Because it would have been so much easier not to fight. When you are sick and exhausted and the legal system seems designed to protect the people who hurt you, when every institution you approach turns away, when your employer has lawyers and you have nothing, the path of least resistance is to let it go. To spend what time you have left with the people you love, not in courtrooms, not fighting motions and continuances and delays, not being examined and cross-examined and argued over like a problem to be managed. They chose the harder path. And the world is permanently different because of it. Grace Fryer made her decision in 1927. She was 26 years old. Her spine was already beginning to collapse. Her jaw had been operated on more than once. She had been dismissed by company doctors, rebuffed by medical examiners, and watched several of her co-workers die of the same mysterious condition that was now eating through her own body. And she decided, with whatever clarity and resolve she had left, that she was going to sue the United States Radium Corporation. Simple decision. Almost impossible to execute. Because finding a lawyer, this is the part that stops me every time I come back to this story, finding a lawyer willing to take the case proved nearly insurmountable. The United States Radium Corporation was not a small operation. It had money, it had influence, it had connections in the legal and business communities of New Jersey that ran deep. More than that, it had a track record of making problems disappear, of managing its employees' illnesses quietly, of using the structures of power and access to ensure that certain questions simply never got properly asked. Any attorney who took Grace's case was taking on not just a lawsuit, but a corporation that had demonstrated its willingness to spend whatever it needed to spend to protect itself. Lawyer after lawyer declined. Some didn't think the case was winnable. Some didn't want the professional exposure. Some, I have no doubt, had existing relationships with the kind of people who could make their careers difficult. Grace spent over a year searching. Over a year, getting sicker, watching time run out, looking for someone to help her. His name was Raymond Berry. He was a young attorney, not yet established, not yet plugged into the networks of professional caution that would have told a more senior lawyer to walk away. He agreed to take the case. Whatever reasons he had, idealism, ambition, a genuine sense of outrage, some combination, Raymond Berry said yes when everyone else had said no, and that matters. That matters in the same way that every single person who said yes when they could have said no matters, all through history, which is to say, enormously. Grace was not alone in the lawsuit. By the time it was filed, there were 5 women. Grace Fryer, whose spine was slowly giving way. Edna Husman, who had lost several teeth and whose jaw had been badly damaged. Catherine Schaub, who had been diagnosed with radium necrosis affecting her hip and pelvis. Irene Rudolph, who had developed similar bone deterioration. And Quinta MacDonald, who was arguably the worst off of all of them, whose health had declined so rapidly that there were real questions about whether she would survive long enough for any legal proceeding to matter. 5 women. 5 names. Remember them. Now. The company's response to being sued by these 5 dying women, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, because I think it is important to let yourself feel the full weight of what I'm about to describe. The company's response was to do everything in its legal power to ensure the case never came to trial while any of the plaintiffs were still alive. I am not speculating here. I am not inferring malice from negligence. The strategy was deliberate, documented, and understood at the time by the attorneys pursuing it. File motions. Request continuances. Challenge procedures. Appeal decisions. Do everything that the law allows a well-funded defendant to do to stretch a legal proceeding across months and years. Because if you can stretch it long enough, if you can push the trial date far enough into the future, then the women who are suing you will die before they can testify in their own defense. The lawsuit dies with them. The liability disappears. The story goes away. The corporation was led at this point by Arthur Roeder, the president who had been in charge during the years when the radium was being applied and the evidence of harm was being systematically suppressed. Its legal strategy was coordinated by a team that understood exactly what it was doing. These were not stupid people. They were not acting out of confusion about the severity of the women's conditions. They knew. They had known for years. The company's own internal medical consultants had known. And the legal strategy was built explicitly around that knowledge, built around the understanding that the plaintiffs were running out of time, and that the goal was simply to outlast them. Raymond Berry began fighting delay after delay. Motion after motion. He was trying to move as quickly as the system would allow, and the system was being used against him at every turn. The women, his clients, his charges, the people for whom this case was literally a matter of life and justice, were watching their bodies deteriorate while legal arguments were made in rooms they were sometimes too sick to reach. There is a particular kind of cold fury that this story produces in me, and I want to be honest about it with you, because I think you might feel it too. It is not the hot fury of shock. It is something quieter and in some ways worse. The fury of watching a system that is supposed to exist to protect people being used, with sophisticated deliberation, as a weapon against the most vulnerable people it could possibly be turned against. The law is not inherently just. It is a tool. And in 1927 and 1928, In the courtrooms of New Jersey, that tool was being wielded by people with money and power against 5 sick women who had nothing but the truth and a young lawyer who was willing to stand with them. The delays worked, partially. By the time any real legal progress was made, the 5 women were in significantly worse condition than when the suit was filed. Time, the company's greatest weapon, had done its work. But it had not done enough. Because Grace Fryer and her 4 companions were still there. Still showing up. Still refusing to be made invisible. And the press, which had initially treated the story as a minor industrial dispute, was beginning to understand that what was happening in those courtrooms was something much larger than a lawsuit. Want to tell you about who they were when they walked, or were carried, or wheeled, into those rooms to demand justice. Grace Fryer arrived in a wheelchair. Her spine, which had been deteriorating for years, required a metal brace that encased her torso and limited the movement of her arms. She could not lift them fully. She could not always sit upright without support. She was 26 years old and the architecture of her body was slowly being dismantled from within by the element she had spent years pressing carefully onto watch faces so that men could read the time in the dark. She came anyway. Every time. Every hearing, every appearance, every legal proceeding that required her presence. Grace Fryer showed up. She sat straight in her wheelchair, as straight as the brace would allow, and she looked at the men across the room who had poisoned her, and she did not look away. I think about that a lot. The particular quality of that gaze. Edna Husman carried herself with a quietness that reporters at the time sometimes described as stillness. She was not a woman who spoke in grand pronouncements or performed her suffering for an audience. She had lost teeth. Her jaw had been reconstructed, imperfectly, and the damage was visible in the way her face had changed from the young woman who had bent over her work in the studio, tip-dipping with such practiced efficiency. She did not seem to feel the need to explain herself or to convince anyone. She was there. She was harmed. She wanted justice. Those 3 facts she held with a dignity that apparently unsettled the company's representatives more than any dramatic statement could have. Catherine Schaub had been one of the more vocal women even before the legal process began. She had spoken to journalists, she had helped draw attention to the conditions the dial painters had worked under, she had been willing to put her name and face to the story at a time when the company was still actively managing the narrative. By the time she appeared in legal proceedings, her hip and pelvis had been significantly damaged, and she walked with difficulty. She was young. She was recognizably, heartbreakingly young. And she knew how to speak. When she had the chance to speak, she spoke clearly and without flinching about what had been done to her and what she had been told and what the company had known. Quinta MacDonald was, by any measure, the most seriously ill of the 5. There were periods during the legal proceedings when her survival from one appearance to the next was genuinely uncertain. She had lost weight that she could not afford to lose. She was in significant pain. And still, and this is the thing, this is always the thing, she was there. She and her family understood that her presence, physical and irrefutable, was itself an argument that no legal motion could file away into a drawer. Irene Rudolph was perhaps the least publicly visible of the 5, her story somewhat less documented in the press coverage of the time, and I want to say her name with the same care I give the others precisely because of that. Because the women who didn't become famous are still part of this. Because Irene Rudolph sat in those rooms too, in her damaged body, asking for something that should never have needed to be demanded. The press, initially, had treated the story the way the press often treats stories of workers suing corporations, as a legal dispute, a human interest note at most, something to mention briefly and move on from. But something changed when the journalists actually saw them. When they were in the room with these 5 women, young, well-dressed in their best clothes because they knew they were being looked at, visibly and profoundly ill, sitting with a composure that reporters found difficult to describe without words like dignified and heartbreaking, something in the coverage began to shift. The story started appearing on front pages. The language changed. The framing changed. What had been reported as a company dispute became, in the hands of journalists who actually sat in those rooms, something that felt much more like what it was, a moral catastrophe. Young women who had been poisoned by their employer for profit, who had been lied to about their symptoms, who had been delayed and obstructed and managed, demanding in their last available time the basic acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. The public began paying attention in a way that it had not paid attention before. And that attention mattered. It created pressure. It made the company's strategy of quiet delay slightly harder to execute without public scrutiny. One reporter who covered the proceedings wrote, afterward, about the specific quality of sitting in a room where 5 dying women made their case with complete and unhurried clarity. He wrote about the contrast, the well-dressed corporate attorneys, the apparatus of legal procedure, the sense of institutional solidity that powerful defendants carry with them into courtrooms. And then he wrote about Grace Fryer, sitting in her wheelchair, not performing tragedy, not asking for pity, simply asking for acknowledgement of what was true. There is a particular dignity available to people who have nothing left to lose except the truth. I don't want to romanticize suffering. These women would have chosen, obviously, to have their health and their lives back rather than whatever strange grace their situation offered them. But there is something real in what I'm trying to describe. When you strip away the considerations that usually make people quiet, the fear of professional consequences, the worry about what people will think, the exhausting work of protecting your reputation and your comfort and your future, when those are gone, when the only thing left is the account you want to give of what happened to you, some people discover a quality of straightforwardness that is almost impossible to look away from. Grace Fryer was that. Edna Husman and Catherine Schaub and Quinta MacDonald and Irene Rudolph were that. 5 women in their 20s and early 30s, in the best clothes they owned, sitting in rooms they often found physically grueling to be in, looking at the men who had harmed them with clear and steady eyes, telling the truth. The company wanted to make them invisible. They refused to be invisible. That refusal, week after week and hearing after hearing, was its own form of victory even before any settlement was reached. In 1928, the case settled out of court. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, a significant sum for working-class women in 1928, though not, when you think about what had been taken from them, a sum that bears any rational relationship to the harm done. Each also received a pension of $600 per year for as long as she lived, along with coverage for all ongoing medical expenses related to her condition. The United States Radium Corporation admitted no wrongdoing. I want to be honest with you about what this settlement was, because the temptation in telling this story is to present it as a triumph, and it was not exactly a triumph. It was a compromise made by dying women who were running out of time. The pension, $600 a year for life, was meaningful only if you lived long enough to collect it for more than a few years. And the women knew, as they signed the documents, that several of them would not. The medical coverage was meaningful only for as long as the medical care could provide any real relief, which for conditions caused by radium poisoning was limited. The $10,000 was real money, and it provided some immediate security. But it was not justice in the full sense of the word. What it was, and this matters enormously, was acknowledgement. Not admission, legally speaking. The lawyers made sure the language carried no formal admission of liability. But in every practical and public sense, the settlement was acknowledgement. The company that had told these women there was nothing wrong with the paint, that had told them their symptoms were caused by syphilis, that had delayed and obstructed and spent years making sure the truth stayed buried, that company had paid them. Had agreed, under the pressure of evidence and publicity and a young lawyer who refused to give up, to compensate them for what had been done to them. The public understood what that meant even if the legal documents were careful about the language. The press coverage of the settlement was extensive, and the tone was very different from the early coverage. Reporters wrote about what the women had endured and what they had achieved. The story had become national news. There were editorials about corporate responsibility. There were calls for legislation. The Radium Girls, as they were now being called, had transformed from an obscure industrial dispute into something that people across the country were talking about over their breakfast tables. Now, what did the women do with the time they had left? Edna Husman used her settlement money to support her family and to ensure her children had some security. She was one of the longest survivors of the group, but the damage to her body had been done, and the years she had remaining were marked by ongoing medical struggle. She lived, as far as the records allow us to understand, with the same quiet steadiness she had shown in the courtrooms. She did not make public statements or seek further attention. She went home and she lived her life for as long as she could. Catherine Schaub, who had been one of the more publicly engaged of the women, continued for a time to be involved in the growing conversation around dial painter health and worker safety. She was aware that the settlement was not the end of the issue, that other women in other cities were still working with radium paint, still being told it was harmless, still being asked to tip-dip. She understood the larger stakes. She died in 1933, in her late 20s. Quinta MacDonald's health had been so severely compromised by the time of the settlement that the years she had were few. She died not long after. The pension she had fought for, that she had appeared in courtroom after courtroom to secure, she collected it for a very short time. Irene Rudolph and Grace Fryer also died in the years following the settlement, their bodies continuing to bear the consequences of what had been done to them in that factory in Orange, New Jersey. I want to sit with that for a moment. I want you to sit with it too. These women fought for years through a legal system that was being weaponized against them. They appeared in rooms where they were examined and questioned and challenged. They endured delays that they understood were designed specifically to outlast their survival. They did all of this, and then they settled, and then they spent the years they had left dying of the thing they had been fighting about. But here is what I also want you to hold alongside that. The settlement, and the public attention it generated, set something in motion that these women could not fully see from where they stood in 1928. It established, publicly and legally, that what the company had done was wrong. It established that workers could fight back. It established that dying women with a lawyer and a refusal to be silent could move corporations that had seemed unmovable. And it set the stage for what happened next, in a different city, a few years later, where another group of women took what the Radium Girls of New Jersey had built and carried it further. There is a particular kind of tenderness I feel for these women, not pity, nothing like pity, but something gentler and more specific. The tenderness of knowing what they could not know, that the thing they were doing would outlive them by almost 100 years. That their names would be spoken by people like me, to people like you, long after the factory in Orange had been torn down and the company that poisoned them had ceased to exist. That the world would be measurably safer because they refused to be quiet. I hope they felt, in those last years, the particular peace of knowing they had done something real. I hope it was enough. Ottawa, Illinois. About 700 miles from Orange, New Jersey. And yet the same story, beginning again. The Radium Dial Company operated in Ottawa from the 1920s, using the same luminous paint, the same techniques, the same business of having young women apply radium compound to watch and instrument dials with small brushes that they were encouraged to point with their lips. The New Jersey case had received national coverage. The health risks of radium were, by the early 1930s, a matter of significant public discussion. And still the Radium Dial Company continued. Still the women were told the paint was harmless. Still the company's management chose profit over the lives of its workers. The women who would eventually challenge the Radium Dial Company faced something even harder than what Grace Fryer's group had faced. Because by the time the Illinois cases reached their critical stages, the legal and strategic playbook for defeating worker claims was better developed. The corporations had learned from New Jersey. They knew how to fight these cases. And the radium dial company was willing to go further than the United States Radium Corporation had gone, further in its denials, further in its attacks on the women who dared to challenge it. Catherine Donohue was one of the dial painters in Ottawa. She had worked at the radium dial company beginning in the mid-1920s, pointing her brush in the now familiar way, applying paint to dials with the same practiced efficiency that had characterized the New Jersey women's work. By the late 1930s, her body was in catastrophic condition. Her hip had been destroyed. She had lost teeth, lost bone mass in her jaw, lost the ability to walk. She was in near constant pain. She weighed, by some accounts, under 70 pounds. Charlotte Passell and the other Ottawa women had suffered similarly. Charlotte had lost an arm to the progressive bone deterioration, a detail that I want to say plainly because I think we sometimes soften the physical reality of what radium poisoning did to these women, and I don't think we should. These were not abstract medical conditions. This was the systematic destruction of young women's bodies by an element their employer had put into their hands and encouraged them to put into their mouths. The radium dial company's response to the claims was to deny everything. Not just to contest the science or dispute the legal liability, but to attack the women themselves, to suggest that their health conditions were the result of their own personal behaviors, their own choices, their own moral failures. It was a strategy of degradation piled on top of a strategy of delay, and it was ugly in a way that still produces in me, when I read the accounts, a particular kind of cold revulsion. The Illinois Industrial Commission proceedings stretched across years. Catherine Donohue, as her health continued to deteriorate, became the public face of the Ottawa case in the way that Grace Fryer had become the face of the New Jersey case. She had a quality that the journalists who covered her described in terms almost identical to those used for Grace: a steadiness, a refusal to perform suffering, a clarity about what had been done to her and what she wanted from the system that was supposed to address it. In 1938, the case came to a hearing. Catherine Donohue could not walk. She could not sit upright unsupported. She was carried into the hearing room on a stretcher and laid down, and she testified. "I want to stop here. I want to ask you to really imagine this. A woman who weighs less than 70 pounds, who has had her body systematically dismantled by a preventable industrial poison, who is in significant pain, being carried into an administrative hearing room on a stretcher, and then, in that position, giving her testimony about what had been done to her and what she knew and what she had experienced. She was not carried in to be seen. She was not carried in as a performance. She was there because she had something to say that needed to be said, and because the legal process required her presence, and because she was willing to endure whatever physical cost was involved in being present. She was carried in because Catherine Donohue was not going to be absent from the most important proceeding of her life simply because her body had been destroyed. She testified. She gave her account clearly. She told the truth, as she had always told the truth, as all these women had been telling the truth for years into the faces of people who had been paid to disbelieve them. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in favor of the women. The radium dial company was found liable for the harm done to its workers. The legal principle being established, the principle that an employer who knowingly exposes workers to dangerous conditions bears responsibility for the harm that results, was being written, in real time, by the testimony of a woman on a stretcher. Catherine Donohue died 5 months later. She was 34 years old. And here, and I mean this, I think this is the most important sentence in this entire story, here is what I need you to understand about what she and the other women won, and what it cost, and why it matters to you personally, right now, tonight. The legal precedents established by the radium girls of both New Jersey and Illinois became the foundation upon which modern occupational health and safety law in the United States was built. The right of workers to sue employers for knowingly exposing them to hazards. The legal requirement that employers protect their workers from known dangers. The principle that corporate knowledge of a risk cannot be suppressed for profit while workers bear the physical cost. That principle, which seems so obvious when stated plainly, did not exist as an enforceable legal reality before these women made it exist. In 1970, the United States government established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the agency that sets and enforces workplace safety standards. The agency responsible for the fact that you cannot, legally, be asked to handle known carcinogens without protection, that your employer must inform you of hazardous materials in your workplace, that the conditions under which you work are subject to external oversight and regulation. OSHA. We say the name so casually, as if it has always existed, as if workplace safety regulation was always the natural order of things. It was not always the natural order of things. It became the natural order of things because Catherine Donohue was carried into a room on a stretcher and told the truth, and the Illinois Industrial Commission heard her, and the legal principle she helped establish was built upon and extended and eventually embodied in federal law. Because Grace Fryer came to courtroom after courtroom in her wheelchair. Because Catherine Schaub spoke to journalists when speaking was dangerous. Because all 5 New Jersey women, and all the Ottawa women, refused to be made invisible. These are not abstract historical achievements. They are the conditions under which you work. The protections you have not because someone granted them to you out of kindness, but because women with no power and no credentials and no advantage except the truth and the courage to tell it refused to stop telling it until the world changed. Catherine Donohue died 5 months after her victory. I think she knew she had won something larger than her own case. I think, in some way, I hope it was enough. I hope the knowledge that she had made something real, something that would outlast her, something that would protect people she would never meet, I hope that was a form of comfort at the end. Winning, and dying, and winning anyway because the law she created outlived her. I cannot think of a better definition of a life that mattered. Let me tell you what the Radium Girls changed. Permanently. In ways that cannot be undone. The legal precedents established through the New Jersey and Illinois cases were cited repeatedly in the decades that followed as the basis for expanding worker protections. When OSHA was finally established in 1970, it represented the formalization and federal codification of principles that had been won in administrative hearings and state courts through cases that traced their lineage back to a factory in Orange, New Jersey, in the 1920s. Every worker in the United States today who can demand to know what chemicals they are being exposed to, every worker who can refuse an unsafe task without automatically losing their job, every worker who has the right to a workplace that meets minimum safety standards, they are the beneficiaries of what these women did. That is not metaphor. That is direct causal history. Trace the line and you will find them at the beginning of it. There is another layer to the legacy, and it is one that carries a particular weight given the century we have since lived through. The bodies of the Radium Girls, in life and after death, contributed materially to the scientific understanding of radiation's effects on human tissue. When atomic weapons research began in earnest during the Second World War, and when questions arose about the safety protocols necessary to protect workers handling radioactive materials at facilities like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, the documented medical histories of the dial painters were among the primary reference materials available. The Radium Girls' suffering informed the safety standards applied to the Manhattan Project. The scientists who built the atomic bomb were, in a very real sense, protected by knowledge that had been extracted from the bodies of young women in New Jersey and Illinois who had no idea they were providing it. The ironies of history are sometimes almost too heavy to hold. Marie Curie died in 1934. She died of aplastic anemia, a failure of the bone marrow to produce sufficient blood cells, almost certainly caused by decades of exposure to ionizing radiation. She had worked with radioactive materials her entire adult life, carrying test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her pockets, keeping radium samples on her bedside table because she loved the soft blue glow. She did not know. The science did not yet exist to tell her. Even she, the woman who had discovered radium and polonium, who had done more than anyone to establish the field of radioactivity as a scientific discipline, even she died without fully understanding what her element was doing to her. The Radium Girls, with no scientific training, with no advanced education, with nothing but their bodies and their willingness to tell the truth about what those bodies were experiencing, they gave the world knowledge that the scientific establishment had not provided. They made the danger legible. They made it impossible to ignore. They did this not by publishing papers or conducting experiments, but by refusing to die quietly and refusing to accept the explanations of people who had decided their suffering was a management problem. There is genuine awe in that. I mean genuine awe, the kind that makes you stop for a moment and recalibrate your sense of who it is that changes the world. And then there is this final detail. The detail I want to give you slowly, the way it deserves. The graves of some of the radium girls still register measurable radioactivity today. Radium-226, the isotope they ingested through years of tip-dipping, has a half-life of approximately 1,600 years. Their bones, when they died, were laced with it. The calcium in their skeletons had been partially replaced by radium, which behaves chemically like calcium and is absorbed into bone tissue in the same way. When their bodies were buried, the radium went into the earth with them. Decades later, researchers measuring radiation levels at certain cemeteries in New Jersey and Illinois have detected elevated readings above the graves. The women are still emitting. The element that destroyed them from within is still present, still active, still measurable by instruments held above the ground where they rest. They glowed in life, faintly, ghostly, blue-white in the darkness of the factory floor, their hair and skin and clothes carrying the luminous traces of the paint they worked with every day. They glow still. In the dark earth, in the quiet of cemeteries that most people drive past without a second thought, the radium girls are still bright. I don't know what to do with that, exactly. It is terrible and it is strange and it is, in a way I find very difficult to articulate, also something close to beautiful. Not beautiful that they suffered. Not beautiful that they died young. But beautiful, maybe, that the universe has not let them be entirely invisible. That the element they carried, the thing that was done to them, marks them still. That they cannot be wholly erased or forgotten, not even by time, not even by the slow patient work of decay. They are still there. They are still glowing. They always will be. Come back with me, for just a moment, to the factory floor. Orange, New Jersey. 1917. The room is large and bright, lit with the particular sharp clarity of industrial lighting. The tables are long and the chairs are close together and the women are young, 17, 18, 20 years old, some of them. They are talking. They are laughing. The work is exacting but their fingers are nimble and practiced, and there is a camaraderie in the room, the warm particular closeness of women who spend their days in each other's company. They are dipping their brushes in small pots of luminous paint. They are pointing the brushes with their lips. They are bending close to the small watch faces, applying the numbers with care, making sure the lines are clean and precise. And as they work, in the parts of the room that are darkened for inspection, their skin begins to glow. Their hair catches the light. Their teeth, when they smile, and they are smiling, talking and laughing on the factory floor, their teeth gleam with a soft blue-white radiance that the supervisors find charming and the workers find funny. Ghost girls, they call themselves. Shining girls. They don't know yet. They are happy, some of them, or something near to happy, earning good wages, in the company of friends, skilled at something real. They don't know what is being deposited in their bones with every brush, every lip point, every inadvertent swallow of something sweet-tasting and invisible and permanent. They would go home and their husbands and children would see them glowing in the dark. They would joke about it. They had no idea. But we know. We know now, in a way the world did not know before they made the world know it. We know because they paid a terrible price to ensure that we would know, and because they spent what strength they had left demanding that the knowledge not be buried along with them. These women, sick and frightened and dying and dismissed, reached forward through time and changed the conditions of your life. The protections you carry to work each day, the regulations that exist between you and the people who would, if there were no consequences, make the same choices Arthur Roeder and the United States Radium Corporation made. Those protections exist because of them. because of what they endured and what they refused to accept and what they built from the materials of their own destruction. Now rest. Their names deserve to be remembered in the morning. Asterisk Grace Fryer. Asterisk. Asterisk Edna Husman. Asterisk. Asterisk Catherine Shaw. Asterisk. Asterisk Quinta MacDonald. Asterisk. Asterisk Irene Rudolph. Asterisk. Asterisk Catherine Donohue. Asterisk. Asterisk Charlotte Purcell. Asterisk. 7 names. 7 women. 7 lives that changed the world from inside the wreckage of what the world had done to them. The dark is less frightening when you know who stood in it before you. When you know that people with nothing, no power, no credentials, no allies, nothing but the truth and the stubbornness to keep telling it, built something out of that darkness that still stands. That they glowed then and they glow still. That the light they carried, terrible and beautiful and permanent, is part of the light you live by now. You are not alone in the dark. You were never alone in it. They made sure of that. Good night.